Welcome everyone back. This is Kripesh here again. I hope I'm audible. So hope you all had a good small little coffee break. And I believe the previous session from Geeta, from Medidata, was very useful. When she actually covered the e-consent, the ECOA, the COVID-19 trackers, and had a very engaging Q&A session as well. So now, at this moment, we are at the fag end of the session, and the next workshop will be delivered by the Veeva Systems, and the focus would be on the technologies that improve site, sponsor, and the CRO executions of studies, and how can they address the global challenges like the COVID-19 situation. So let me take this opportunity to introduce the workshop facilitators from Veeva team, Natalie Townsend and Richard Young. So Natalie Townsend, the Senior Solutions Consultant, is responsible for providing technical expertise and delivering tailored product demonstrations to address the customer needs. Through 17 years experience spanning technical support, the project management and consultancy roles within life sciences, Natalie has gained extensive insights into industry challenges and the knowledge and drive to identify innovative solutions. And the second facilitator, Richard Young, Vice President Strategy, is responsible for establishing Vault CDMS as the best-in-class solution for all the data acquisition, management, and reporting purpose. This requires the considerate provision of thought leadership, developing product and market strategy, and coordinating resources across the customer's life cycle. With 25 years experience in life sciences, Richard is known for its keen executive vision and proven operational experience in data management, e-clinical solutions, and advanced strategies. So with that, I pass it on and welcome Natalie and Richard to take it over from me. Thank you. Over to you.
Thank you, Kripesh. So yes, we'll be talking about those technologies that improve site, sponsor, and CRO execution of studies. And we'll also be thinking, of course, as we go throughout this session, how has COVID-19 impacted how we approach technology for clinical trials? What do we need to think about moving forwards? How do we make sure that we adapt should we find ourselves in similar circumstances again in the future?
We'll be... Sorry, if everyone could go on mute. I'm getting an echo back.
Is anyone
else hearing the echo?
Natalie, do you have an issue?
I'm getting an echo back on everything. Can you hear me now okay?
Yeah. Perfect.
Okay, the echo's gone away, so maybe there was someone not on mute. I didn't want to hear myself twice. So we're going to be talking through what are those typical industry challenges, concentrating quite a bit on EDC design and how does EDC design how can we build things faster? How can we fuse together design and specifications? How can we improve the UAT processes? Because I fundamentally believe that if you take care of those core technology elements, you're going to be setting yourselves up to be able to succeed in virtual trials and in more innovative virtualization considerations, etc. So we'll be kind of marrying those two things together as we go through today's presentation. How can we reduce manual processes? How can we make teams work more efficiently? How can we work with more configurability within systems and so that change management is more straightforward? How can we minimize validation effort? One of the questions on the previous session was around how do we manage things like protocol amendments, especially as trials become more adaptive. What does virtualization mean to sites? How can we make sure that we have technologies to improve site engagement, their satisfaction and performance, as well as then the knock-on effect on patient satisfaction and performance? These are all of the considerations that we've put into the presentation today as we go through. So before I talk through some demonstration pieces, I'm going to pass over to Richard to really help set the scene on what we've put together in today's presentation.
Thank you, Natalie. Good morning, good afternoon, everybody. It is an absolute pleasure to be with you today. So thank you very much to Mayank and the SCDM team for inviting us. It is a true pleasure and an honor to have an opportunity to speak with you today. Before we start the presentation, I think it should fit very well with what's been discussed before, because we've listened to Craig talk about kind of the rethinking of the word hybrid, and that's very much in line with our thinking. It's this idea that COVID and the needs of change in data management is much a philosophy as it is a technology change. It's about changing the hearts and minds of people in every possible way and using technology to its best optimum possibility. And as we go through that today, and Natalie is going to spend time discussing that and presenting that and seeking your feedback, we thought it'd be useful to go back just a few years to 2017 and look at the results of the Tufts survey that we sponsored, because it helps set the scene. It talks about the average time companies take to do tasks. Now, this is just 3 years old, and it was done in an anonymous manner in terms of across all systems, so we won't dig into that. But the result from 280 companies shows that on average, it takes almost 70 working days to build a database. It shows, when it comes to the collection of data, that the average time it takes for sites to enter that data is over 8 days. It also showed that it takes anything up to 36 days to lock a database after last patient, last visit. And something that was touched on in the last few sessions, and I've seen a lot of the questions, is about amendments. Because let's face it, protocol amendments are a critical and almost core part of what we do. I mean, we see from some of that data that 14 to 18 migrations per study. And the reason I like this slide and to highlight it is because it shows that technology has a long way to go. And I think it is incumbent upon us as an industry to really put pressure on technology to get better. Now, if we go to the next slide, Natalie, I think what gets very interesting is as we did these discussions with customers and we deep dived into this with industry experts, many of you who are on the call today, we realized there's an immediate opportunity to take 4 weeks off database design. That's a minimum. Let's get from that 10 all the way down to 6. That's a minimum basic requirement. Now, many of you may not be at 10 weeks, so it's a bigger step. Some of you might also be less than 10 weeks. Remember, 10 was the average. But let's get down to 6 weeks. Now, why did we pick 6? Why did that become the number? Because that was linked to a key piece of information. As part of the survey, we asked people how often they release their database after first patient, first visit. And across these 280 companies, something very, very clear began to emerge. And that is that companies that never release their database after first patient, first visit, that is companies that always have their database ready before they deliver FPI, their average time for data entry was actually just 5 days, 5.4 days, in fact. And their average time for database lock was just 31.4 days. Compare that to companies that always release their database after first patient, first visit. Well, the data entry time doubles. It goes from 5.4 to 10.2 days. But I used to be a data manager, and I used to say, don't worry if we get off to a slow start. We catch it up as we go on. We'll speed up as the trial goes on. So you would assume then that the database lock times would have not changed. But actually, the database lock time increased by almost 60%. So if you release your database after first patient, first visit, that database lock timeline that was 31.4 days is suddenly 53.8 days. So contrary to my popular belief that don't worry, we're data managers, will always catch up, turns out we don't. We actually get slower. And from this was born this idea of we have to be able to set up in 6 weeks, because that's the only way we could assure the database was ready before first patient, first visit. And we set off to do that, and now that's been achieved. In fact, the target now becomes 4. But actually, what have we seen under COVID? We've seen under COVID 4 weeks is just too long. We've been able to build databases in 40 hours. We've seen companies seek from first contact to contract to go live in under a week. Under pandemic situations, all of these numbers become highly challengeable. And that is what I'm looking forward to hearing from Natalie today as she does the presentation. Database design is perhaps the first one to handle. It's the one that we manage most easily. As we go into data entry, it's about how we work with the sites, how we make sure the sites are built up to be successful, and we're not just putting more and more technology on them. As we move to database lock, it becomes all of the data. So it becomes complete and concurrent. How do we have all of your data all of the time? Because locking in 53.8 days is just not going to be acceptable. And we talk about protocol amendments as if they're a dirty word, but actually we do them on just about every study. The number of changes per amendment is growing. We should no longer run away from amendments. We should embrace it. And as we go towards adaptive trials, platform trials, we have to accept that personalized medicine means amendments of one type or another are not only here to stay, but they're going to become regular everyday practice. You can't be migrating databases at all. This has to be a natural order of our day. And I share that because as we go through today, I will keep coming back to and ask you, how does philosophy meet technology? What is the philosophy change that we need to make this industry better? And what is it that we need from technology to match that philosophy? And if we achieve that, if we go to my last slide, Natalie, what we will get to very quickly.
I don't know if there is another.
There we go. If we look at where philosophy meets technology, we will have a faster, simplified study build process. We will have real-time access to study data, making decision-making faster, more effective. It means we can make decisions with confidence that we didn't have previously. And of course, it means simplified amendments with no study migrations. It means we can now make even small changes quickly to optimize the clinical trial. And if we do that, it means we'll be running the trial we need, not the trial our technology limits ourselves to. And with that, Natalie, I'm going to hand to you to get into the main body of our presentation today. And thank you very much to everyone for listening. So Natalie, over to you.
Thank you, Richard. And I echo those thanks to everyone and for SCDM inviting us to provide this today. So what sort of challenges are there that technology needs to rise to? I mean, even without COVID-19 in the picture, I'm sure that there's nothing new here to the audience. Protocols have been becoming more and more complex year on year. The data sources, the volume of data is becoming more complex to handle. For a long time now, there's needed to be more flexibility in the way that trials are executed. FPI timelines are getting tighter and tighter. Protocols need those changes like Richard has been talking about. They're not a dirty word. They are just part and parcel now of the types of trials that are being run. And modern solutions really have to embrace the direction that the industry is moving in and not become a limiting factor in how we go about designing studies, especially as we start to think about COVID-19 and as we start to see the acceleration that there has been in the need to have more virtualized elements introduced. I'll move to my next slide. Broadly speaking, the impact of COVID-19 has been twofold. We've seen that we're having traditional challenges become magnified. So, for example, the need to adopt protocols is more important than ever to deal with what that has introduced. Having to change existing studies just at the drop of a hat has been magnified by the COVID-19 situation. But it's also, of course, introduced some new challenges. Now we don't just have a desire to explore decentralized trials. It has somewhat started to force our hand in the industry. There is that worldwide push, of course, to find vaccines in COVID-19 that are seeing timelines that, quite frankly, would never have been considered possible before. And now we're seeing studies being built in hours rather than in weeks and months, which I think is unbelievable and is something that we will explore in today's presentation in more detail. Now, this may be a fairly simplified slide in terms of what the pillars of success are. There are, of course, a myriad of different roles and considerations in what you need to make a trial successful. But when we're thinking about technology, you need to have those strong technology foundations in place that support the core pillars that we're talking about today, the sponsors, the CROs, the sites, and the patients. Each of these is, of course, critical in their own way. Now, when we're building out technology to meet their needs, we've often seen in the industry that we expand on what we've got. We keep building and adding on what exists today to support those different stakeholder needs. As new challenges come out, we add on to what we already have. We bolt on new features, we come up with a new module. And what that's led to over the years is having quite large and complex and inflexible structures. If you imagine building multiple extensions onto an old stately mansion home, it can become pretty difficult to navigate. The new and the old don't fuse together. They feel different. They're not cohesive in the way that they look and they feel. It becomes very costly to maintain. So as we think about how to best address the old and the new challenges together, this is where the idea of that core philosophy comes in. How can we create strong and lasting and future-proofed foundations in terms of our technology architecture so that we can then build on that, adapt it as we need to, and accelerate towards much more virtual models? This is where I've got a few slides just to think about what that core foundational piece needs to be. Before we even think about building a solution on top of this, what is that foundational architecture? So first of all, think about those documents that need to be shared across sponsors, sites, CROs. Veeva have a history in document management and technology that allows us to share those documents seamlessly out across all of the different groups. But we also need to think about the data. The data is, of course, also critical to share across the teams. So as part of any foundational layer that you're thinking about from a technology solution, you have to make sure that there is a comprehensive means of sharing both data and documents across all of those stakeholders, regardless of who is working with who, on what trial they're working on. Just make sure that the security and access models are there and don't infringe on the ease of sharing that out. Don't put barriers up between all of these different stakeholders that make their lives really difficult to work on. Make sure you've got an architecture that's really extendable and flexible. So if you do need to suddenly change direction, as we have all seen this year, it's very easy to do so without having to go back and rebuild that foundational layer all over again. When sponsors are working with multiple CROs, when there are assets that might need to be transferred, the traditional approach of having a URL ownership, for example, it can cause challenges, it can cause complications, it can all even start to cause some friction between everyone that's working on it. So this clinical data exchange idea that I have here up on the slide is really looking at how we can better shift away from that model. The data exchange approach on the first two slides that we've looked at here is really to fix that challenge of visibility. Ensure that there's visibility whether or not the CRO is doing the build work, the sponsor is doing the build work. If there are those assets to be transferred, that you don't have to lift and shift and change all of your processes. You want the processes to just continue regardless of where this information actually sits within a technology solution. You just want to make sure you can adjust the access accordingly. So whoever's building what, where, and when, think about how the underlying technology could use something like the clinical data exchange to make sure the stakeholders are all set up for maximum success throughout the trial. And think about the sites in all of this. Sites are often overwhelmed with the number of different solutions across all of the sponsors and the CROs that they interact with study by study. So at Veeva, we've really believed that sites should be empowered with their own tools as part of the clinical trial. And later on in the presentation, we'll see an example of how we've gone about this, how we've approached this by providing sites with a free eReg binder, for example, so that they can share their study documentation for remote monitoring purposes, but also so that they have somewhere to store all of that documentation electronically themselves rather than having paper-based processes. And of course, in these times of COVID-19, that is a way in which we've been able to very quickly adapt and allow for that SDV process to continue despite the remoteness now of the work that needs to be completed. And on this screen, you can see there's a whole wealth of different documentations that site needs to work with, from safety distribution letters through to training certificates through to payment documentation. Imagine having a place where sites can have all of that information centrally without having to change study by study by study their practices and their ways of working. And if we think about these solid foundational pieces, if you take care of these, your time is then not going to be tied up. It's not going to be tied up in admin, in logistics, in IT. And that means that it can free up your team members to then really focus on those mission critical patient-related activities that have been talked about extensively today around patient retention, patient recruitment, patient engagement activities. Let the IT piece take care of itself so that the team can really start to look into those patient-facing strategies. Now I'm going to shift gear a little now. We've talked about that foundational piece. Now I want to think about what am I building on top of my foundation? And the focus here is using EDC as an example. So we have 5 principles of agile design. What I'm going to do now is walk through these 5 principles, and then we'll take a look at some examples of how they work for just your typical studies, and then think about, well, how might you then have COVID-19 studies, and how might you want to adapt a lot of this to take into account that we are starting to see more hybrid models and virtual models come into play, and that you need to be able to account for all of those when you're thinking about your EDC design. So the first one being standards and reuse, thinking about what are your sets of standards, and how can you reuse elements either from those or from any other studies that you have worked on previously. How do we make study build more straightforward? How can we fuse together the specification and design processes so that you're not working in a waterfall way that takes weeks and weeks and weeks to do, which right now for COVID-19 just isn't acceptable? How can we merge all of that together to bring efficiencies? And then in the technology itself, how can we make sure that you're not spending unnecessary time programming, custom programming rules? How can we start to move custom programming into configuration so that it is quick and simple for study build teams to work on? And then when you test that design, how can we make sure that that UAT process is a more collaborative process so that it's not test, fix, again, extending those timelines out? How can we have more real-time and risk-based UAT processes? And we'll talk through some of that. And I think it is a hot topic, and I'll be asking the audience, feel free to start thinking about it now. I'll be asking you for your experience on amendments. What pain points have you had in the past? What does amendments mean to you? And then I'll be showing you what amendments means to us here at Veeva, and of course take your questions about that area as well. So if we start with standards, from a standards perspective, what I want to think about is development of standards. What are the challenges here? There's probably 2 camps. You've probably got camps where there are a lack of standards altogether, and it's quite hard to get started on defining those standards. And then when I talk to organizations, there are organizations that have reams and reams of standards that is actually very difficult to work with. It's almost that they have too many standards, which means it's very difficult to govern and very difficult to implement. Hence the governance piece here. Often there's too few people involved in this process, so it's not always a collaborative effort going through and looking at what those standards need to be. And it can be difficult to then actually implement those without actually having a good, strong governance in place. How do you make sure that you're using your standards in the right way, that there's a relevant approval process in place, that you're able to compare your existing study back to your standards and identify where there have been deviations, which is where the actual utilization challenges come in. Having some discipline about when are you using your standards? Are you collecting data that's unnecessary? Especially as you start to think about how studies may need to be redesigned to meet some more of these hybrid style models. Are you collecting data in your CRF that's actually also being duplicated somewhere elsewhere because you're collecting that data remotely? Are you feeding that back into your standards so that you're not then having extra reconciliation efforts that just simply are no longer relevant because you haven't gone through the processes of reviewing and updating your standards in a governed way. And how can you get metrics out about how you're utilizing your standards? Are your standards serving you well? Standards are there to really ensure that timelines are sped up, and of course that you're standardizing what you're getting out at the end of a study. But are you measuring if they are being successful? Have you got any KPIs around that area? And when we speak to teams, it's often an area that they have standards, but they're not necessarily measuring against those standards. So something for the team here to consider when putting those together. Which moves me on to the considerations, because of course when you have agreed that you're going to either put standards in place or you're going to go through a review cycle, what is it that you want to have those key conversations about? So are there requirements by TA? Are there corporate standards or TA standards? Standards, but you want to actually lift and shift them into another system. Is there a study that you want to start, like a successful study that could become a stepping stone to other study designs in the future, so that you're not starting from scratch if you don't already have a set of standards in place? And then looking across your studies to find what are those common elements, what forms, items, rules, etc. do you want to reuse? What governance do you want to put in place around that? How can you decide what is a reusable component versus maybe a study-specific element that you built out? Again, when I've spoken to organizations, everything gets put into the standards, which means the standards are no longer really standards. They're just a catch-all of everything you've ever done, which is not really the intention of what those standards need to be. So consider, how do you go about governing that piece? And of course, as we bring those virtual trial capabilities into the mix, how do you need to incorporate those new requirements into your standards? Make sure that they're not just a rigid set that you come up with. They need to be a living and working and version-controlled piece that you revisit regularly as protocols and as the industry continues to evolve. I won't go extensively through this slide. I think I've talked to many of these already, but just there are sets that we have seen as best practices that have worked around that governance. So essentially having that committee, we'll share these slides out so that you can see all of the detail, of course, but just making sure that the team see the value of the standards that are introduced. Make sure the wider team understand that they've been trained, that there are processes in place, and that you don't overcomplicate this. You don't want standards to become burdensome, and that you look at the effectiveness of those and then adapt if you do see something that is no longer effective. Don't, I guess, stand by your standards if they're not working for you. Be ready, just like we have been with protocols, be ready to be very adaptive as you move forwards with those. And ultimately, the goal from a standards perspective is for standards to move from being unappreciated to being applauded, to be valued by teams, for teams to want to use these when they start with their study design, but to keep things flexible as well, of course. Make sure the reusable elements are going to be working for you. Because, and it's a core theme as I go through everything today, wherever you can find efficiencies in your design processes, you're going to feel the benefits in terms of the knock-on effect on the workload, on the availability of team members to focus their efforts on making sites and patients successful within the clinical trial element. Think about CRAs, for example. If CRAs are working with study designs that they have familiarity with and that have the same types of processes in place because of the way in which data is being captured and reviewed, they don't have to go through a learning curve every single time they start monitoring on a study. Hence, the CRA has then freed up to be sat forming that relationship with the site and working with the site on what their recruitment strategy is, for example. Now, on to the meat of the study build. So as we think about study build, there's a few challenges in each of these areas that I want to talk through, and then I've got a short demonstration that I will share with you on how we've gone about approaching study build at Veeva in an innovative way. And then we'll take a pause to see if there are any questions so far before we start thinking about COVID-19 in more detail.
So Natalie, it's Richard. There is a question. Can I just position that question with you as you go through this?
Of course.
It's a perfect setup. So the question is, in order to achieve the 4 to 6 week build, the protocol must be one of the key items. So could you, just as you go through this, talk about how we take the protocol to create draft specifications so that you go to the kickoff meeting with your draft documents rather than thinking of the protocol as a standalone item? If you could cover that, and I know you'll do it in the demo, and I'll type a further answer into the Q&A as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Great question. And do please keep them coming as well. We'll be happy to address them during the demonstration and, of course, as we go as well. Which fits quite nicely in this slide, in fact. So one of the first challenges in this area is around casebook specifications and build. So lengthy study build processes. When you think about this from a traditional perspective, the first thing you do is create a specification document. And that's often because EDC systems are quite difficult to build in. So we create a specification document in the industry, and then after that's been through iterations, reviewed and approved, it then gets passed over to the study team, the technical or programming team to build that out in EDC. And then there is back and forth and review in this very kind of linear way in which things get built, reviewed, modified, reviewed. You can see here the cycle on the screen. It can extend out to be weeks and weeks and weeks and weeks worth of effort. Now, I'll move on to a few more challenges before we see how we resolve each of these challenges. Because during that build, there is, of course, complexity in terms of custom code needing to be written. So we have seen that it is necessary in fairly traditional systems that custom code can introduce delays, can introduce a lot of rigidity into the process as well. So it can take between 30 minutes and up to 8 hours to write custom code in things like C# or Java. It can then take a lot of time to, of course, test that. There might be changes that need to be made, which means more time in the build process. When those custom pieces actually get put into the system, they can slow the system down because of the nature in which they've had to be written. And of course, when you come to do amendments, it can introduce risk because you've also got to consider what the amendment knock-on effect is going to be to that custom code. So combined with the specification piece we've just talked about, and as well, the UAT challenges that we talked about. Sorry, I missed the slide out there. This is the slide, sorry, where we were talking about those custom code pieces. We also need to think about what the challenges are with UAT. So when it comes to UAT, it's often done in silos. So there will be different teams doing their own UAT piece, not all working together and comparing their knowledge of the protocol to make sure it really is hitting off on every single point that it needs to. Because we've had to go through that process we talked about from specification into programming, into UAT, it's really difficult to kind of get that live feedback and get things fixed quickly. If you just spot something little that needs to be changed, it often has to go through quite a long process to actually get implemented to then be retested. And the specification process often means that there can be issues with interpretation about what it was that was actually wanted, and then when you see it up there on the screen, how it actually looks, which can also mean that you've then got to go back through those review cycles. Because of the way in which things are built out, it means that there can be limited opportunity for teams to get together to review the design and bounce ideas off each other. There might be people that come in that haven't been involved at all yet as part of the specification and come in and have their own ideas that are then very difficult to introduce into the design. And metrics and tools for reviewing and improving the design, something I touched upon a little earlier in the presentation, making sure that you've got some metrics to hinge on that show you what has been successful in the past and therefore you might want to consider using again. Maybe in studies in the past, you built out many edit checks that just never fired, for example. If you've got that type of data, you can make sure you think about that in your next design. Maybe you had edit checks or rules that fired lots and lots and lots of times. So you might want to consider designing the form in a way that is more understandable to the site with some help text included to prevent the need for that amount of queries in the future. So having that type of knowledge when you're designing your study can, of course, make sure that you're able to further optimize it.
Sorry, Natalie.
So what technology? Go ahead.
Sorry, Natalie. Can I just go back to your past? Because I would like to answer a question here, if I may. So apologies for the interruption. So there's a question about adaptive multi-arm trials. I know you're going to show this a little bit in the demo, but I think one of the things I'd like to share with the audience is, classic data management systems, you have to build a unique element for each component of the trial. So if you think about cycles and visits, whether it's as simple as labeling it as cycle 1 and cycle 2, you build unique elements for those possibilities. And in the world of adaptive multi-arm trials, that means you're building elements that may never be used, but you're having to forecast what might be required for the totality of your database. What we've done here is we've introduced dynamics, which I'm going to ask Natalie to show and explain a little bit of, because then you use intelligence within the database that simply says, if patient does X, add or remove these items and automatically relabel and build a database for that patient. And as you go through your review process, reviewing those dynamics is incredibly simple compared to thinking through every possible variation. It also reduces the burden of effort of your build process because you're not building all those custom functions that say if, do. You're literally just saying, under these situations, this dynamic must either add or remove or relabel, and it needs to do it differently depending on the options going forward. Now, it's a lot easier to see or to understand as you see it, so I'm going to ask Natalie to show that as we go through. But I'll also put an extended answer in the chat as well. But I just wanted to say, in this situation, that 4 to 6 week timeline that a lot of questions are about, that includes for us platform trials. We've done a trial in under 4 weeks that was, I think, 17 protocols in one, and I can provide some details in the chat about that. Okay, so by removing that white space, you generally get faster and the effort goes down for everyone. That's why this is applicable to all of your trial types. But I'll pause there and let you show that, Natalie. So apologies for the interruption, and I'll put some more in the chat.
No worries, Richard. We'll certainly be touching on that in the demonstration to show you that cycle time example and the dynamics in place. And I think this slide helps to talk about that protocol question as well. So the protocol, yes, of course, it's essential as part of that study design. And our process here at Veeva has been to really build off the back of the protocol, not to take the protocol, then spec out the protocol, then build the EDC system. It's been use the protocol as a starting point, build out your study design, of course, based on things like your schedule of events, and consider what dynamics you might need based on patients requiring certain labs in certain circumstances. And this is the idea of fusing that design and specification together, because as you'll see in my demonstration, as we start to build out the system, it then self-documents, because of course you are going to want documentation of what has been built. There needs to be something for your records, of course, and you want to probably still have SOPs that have got that specification as part of it, so you can develop and pull that specification out of the system, but you're not going through that process of having to do all of that speccing up front. So it really is this idea of building, pulling the design out as you go, having a means of capturing collaboration. So we'll talk about that a little shortly, about having people review what you've built, change it on the fly, re-review it. All of that is how we've been able to get those timelines down, because right from the very start, we're looking at how can we shave time off? How can we make this less waterfall? How can we make it much more agile so that we're not talking about weeks and weeks of effort, we're talking about that 4 week timeline, and even less when we start thinking about COVID-19. And Richard just touched upon some of these ways in which we can simplify the complex designs. So the idea of having a reusable event group. If you've got an oncology cycle, maybe the patient has 15 cycles. They're probably quite similar. Maybe there's a few different data forms you're collecting for certain cycles. But instead of building those all out uniquely, build them out once and then use dynamics to add in any nuances that there might be. Use label overrides to name them uniquely. So instead of having to build them out just so that you can extract and have the site enter the data for each correctly named visit, I'll show you how we can just have a quick label override so that it comes out of the system with the right naming convention. branch out and build logic in so that it's really easy for the end users to enter their data, but also really easy for the people who are building the studies to build that logic in. So this is a way in which we're moving from those custom functions into this powerful rule-based engine. So our rules engine has been designed to really take care of anything that you might need to do. As well as we've been looking at what rules we have in the rules engine and looking, can we actually eliminate needing to build them out altogether and just make them a configurable element? And I'll show you an example of that shortly, where if you want to dynamically make fields appear, you don't need to write an edit check, you just need to tick a box and the box will take care of that for you. But of course, there are still going to be the needs for fairly complex, quite often, rules where you are having dynamics that add in multiple different events or forms in the instance that a patient meets a certain criteria. You want to build multiple layers of logic into those. Still no need for custom programming. The rules engine can take care of all of these different actions and functions that you can see here as examples on the screen. So whether you want to be setting values, sending emails, adding in all of your dynamics, raising all of your queries, the engine will take care of all of those elements all in one place for you rather than relying on that traditional custom programming. And one of the examples that we have seen has been a protocol that we were able to load into the Veeva system that had 32 cycles. Because of the reusability, we were able to reduce that down to just 2 different cycles based on the route of administration for this particular product and based on the dosing schedule, whether or not the patient was going to be weekly or bi-weekly. So we were able to really hugely reduce the build effort down in this very complex protocol. So if we can do this for a very complex protocol and get this down to a 4 to 6 week build, I'm sure you can imagine how quick and easy it is to build a much more simpler study and really start to smash through that ceiling of study build timelines. Finally, before we start thinking about having a look at the system, UAT is typically that ping pong approach that I've talked about. So 1 to 1 to 1 to 1 to 1, delays all the way. I've sat in many a UAT myself in previous lives when I've been a project manager, where you know that you're going to submit your UAT findings and then you're probably going to wait a few days for somebody to reprogram something, and then you're going to re-review it, and you might find just one little thing that's still left, send it back, wait a few days, and suddenly you've lost 2 weeks getting kind of your UAT pieces fixed, ready for go live, and you're sat there nervously thinking, I need this live before FPI. And we really did not want to have that be something that we sat down with Veeva customers to have to explain. So we've taken a much more live and iterative approach to UAT, where you can get around a table. Of course, currently that's a virtual table, but provide real-time feedback. If you say, oh, I'd prefer that form to look like this, I'd prefer it to be a drop-down list rather than radio buttons. I prefer it if maybe we gave this header, or I added this help text in, or I need this visit to have this form because you've put it in this place, but actually it's now been updated in the protocol to have it here. All of those different considerations during build, we can just change on the fly as we go, so that you can then real time see and say, yes, that's what I wanted. So when it comes to then kind of executing and signing off on that formal UAT, there's very rarely too much left to have to go through this kind of ping pong approach with, because you've already addressed all of those types of typical UAT findings as part of this iterative approach. So let's see that in action. I think there's been quite a lot in the slides there to consider as part of that build philosophy, but a lot of that will become clear as we look at how do we go about simplifying that study design. So I'll just pause there to maybe see if there are any further questions before we jump into the system.
I think you're good, Natalie. I'll work a few in. No. I'm busily typing, so if anyone else has questions, I am trying to respond, and I'm going to try and incorporate them into Natalie.
Keep Richard busy, everyone. Okay, so I'm going to share my screen. Just make sure this as I expect. Okay. One second while I make sure I'm doing this correctly. Okay, just to verify, if someone could let me know if you can see the screen.
You can. If you could just increase the font size a little bit, that might be helpful.
I will. How's that looking?
That's much better, thank you.
Brilliant. Okay. So I have logged in. This is really just a flavour of the type of way in which we simplify studies. Richard could tell you that I could talk about this for probably about 4 days if you let me, but I'm sure you've all got other things to do later on. So as a flavour of how we go about simplifying that study design, I've logged into an example study here. If I come back one, you'll see I'm actually in my development environment right now. Studio is the build area for Vault EDC, CDMS, and this is where all of your study build elements come into play. So your units, your items, your forms. When we talked earlier about standards, you can of course bring in your forms from your standards. You can set studies up from scratch from your sets of standards. As you can see here, I can pull these in from anywhere else that I've already used them before, and that will involve, of course, any sets of TA or overarching standards that I might want to call upon. My events, my event groups that we will take a look at an example of, because that really is one of the ways that we've reduced those things like oncology cycles, but also things like follow-up visits that you don't want to have to build out uniquely each and every time, and my code lists. All of our rules, we'll take a look at an example of one of the rules shortly. Ways in which we can just link forms together. So if you want to link up your AE to your COMED form, you just say you want to link them together, and that will create the link so that for your data extract, for your end users, they can say what COMEDs relate to what AEs. And this, of course, extends to linking your AEs and your anything else, your COMEDs, your medical histories, anything where a link makes sense. It's very straightforward to set that up. But where I'm going to go into is my study schedule. So here is my study schedule. It's a very visual way of looking at all of the different events. So my screening event group, my screening visit, and then all of my forms that are associated with my screening visit. My treatment cycle is an example of where I've just built out one treatment cycle. So this is an example oncology study. It has got a cycle selection, which is a dynamic. So based on the cycle selection, it's going to decide when to display what forms, and we'll take a look at that example rule. But I've got a day 1, a day 8, a day 15, and that's it. Because what I have done is, if we look over onto the properties pane on the right-hand side, I have said as part of my properties that this is a repeating item group. So currently there are 15 cycles. Every time the site say they want to add a new cycle, it will just add in a new cycle for them. And it will use this label override to correctly name the cycle accordingly. So I have not had to build out my 15 different cycles. The system simply repeats this and applies the necessary dynamics each time based on whatever patient it is and whatever criteria they meet within the EDC system. So if I needed to change these, if this was like odd and even, whatever my naming convention was, that's all the effort I need to go through to uniquely label these cycles. And I'm sure for any of you that have been involved in the build of oncology cycles, or any study, as I mentioned, where you have got the same type of visit multiple times, you don't have to build them out each and every time. And then when it comes to an amendment later on, if you need to add to this, you can change the number of cycles. So maybe there's 20, maybe there's 25. A lot of the time you might just not know up front how many there are going to be. From that perspective, you're going to have to take a stab at how many to build out initially. You might build out too many, you might build out too little. And then as part of your amendment, could then be a lengthy process to build these out, or you might have put lots of unnecessary effort into building them out in the first place. So we're eliminating that risk and that decision because it's so straightforward to increase this as is necessary. We won't save that change. Now, I completely appreciate that, of course, every cycle is not always the same. So let me show you a rule that's been based on that particular cycle. That is to add my resist information. So these are all of the rules in my study. If I open up this rule, it's a very straightforward rule builder. And as I mentioned, you can take whatever action you need to from within this particular area. This rule is defining that at cycle 3, 6, 9, and 12, I'm going to add these forms. So this is an example of how we can add those different dynamics into the system without custom programming. This is simply just a selection tool, very easy syntax-based language. And once a patient gets entered into cycle 3, 6, 9, or 12, it's going to add in these relevant forms. Now, of course, I could build out additional complexity in this. There's a function area here where I can select information to build out additional statements. So maybe only if the patient is on a certain cohort, or if the patient has not had dose interruption. There might be lots of other or statements I want to add into this, but I've got full flexibility in here to build out even more complex elements, again, without the need to go off and write a couple of hours worth and test a couple of hours worth of code. So that's a flavor of how those dynamics, go ahead.
There's a question that might be timely. I'm just typing a response. As you are making these changes, is there a way to view them so that you don't have to publish or promote each version to test?
There is, and it's almost as though we have written the script together with whoever had asked that question, because I am about to do that exact thing now. So that is where we think about that iterative approach to UAT. You don't want to build all of this out and then test it all. You probably want to be checking as you go that what you've got in this schedule view has got all of the dynamics that you'd expect it to have. So let me open up a data entry screen for us. And in my data entry screen, I don't have to log in or out. I can just open up another tab, because then side by side, I can start to take a look at what is it that I have built out. So I can come in, I've got a patient here that I've already added, and whatever we enter into here is essentially going to be reflective of whatever my current study design is. So if I, for example, came into demographics and made a change in here as part of my studio piece, we'll then see the change reflected in the screens that we just saw. So as I'm in here, let's go ahead and make a quick change. So for example, our demographics, our sex is currently radio buttons. Maybe as the study team designed this, they go, I don't want this to be radio buttons like this. I want it to be a drop down. Well, they can just come in and make the change and say that instead of vertical, I want it to be a pick list as my control type. And then we can go ahead and check and see, has that done what it needed to do? So if I come in, I might need to reset it. We'll have a look. And there we go. So live and real time, as you make changes, they're immediately available for you to review as you go. So hopefully that answers that question. So what I am going to go ahead and do here, because I'm going to make an amendment as part of a later piece of this demonstration, let me show you how we can drag and drop into this area. So one example that I actually did recently with a customer was, as part of their adverse events form, they wanted to bring in criteria about an adverse event of special interest. So currently in my adverse event form, I'm not asking any AESI details, and I want to add that in. So we can drag and drop from any existing items or item groups, or we can create these entirely from scratch if you want to as well, which is very easy to do. But I've already created an AESI item, and I can just drag and drop that in. here. So as you go through your design, you drag, you drop, you decide, do you want it to be what control types? Your properties let you do things like range checks, etc. But in the interest of time, I'm just going to leave it at that. And then I have a whole group of items that I've created about this AESI that I'm going to drag and drop into. So item groups allow you to group together any questions that you want to ask and then visually present them in such a way to the user. And what it also allows you to do is add in form level dynamics. So I only want to see the AESI details if I say yes to this question. So as I was talking in the slides earlier, there's no need for you to write a rule for that. All you need to do is to come in to your properties. We have this area called progressive display. You simply edit this and say that if the AESI equals yes, then I'm going to display this group. So all of those form level dynamics will now be in place. And whenever we say yes, as indicated by this little icon here, it's dependent on that AESI item. No other work is needed, apart from, of course, going through and testing that that does as we expect. And what I will do shortly is we'll go through what that amendment process looks like to see how would that affect existing patient records if this were being done within a live trial. But they were the key highlights I wanted to show as part of the study build simplification process today. I will pause in case there are questions. Otherwise, we shall move on to take a look at COVID-19.
There's one key topic you might be covering later, which is fine, and that is the diff report. There's several questions about testing, retesting, UAT. It's about the diff report. If you're covering that now or later, be great.
We will definitely be covering the diff report.
Perfect.
Okay, so let me come back to our slides momentarily. Are we able to get the slides back up, Eric? Thank you very much. I'm really sorry because I'm also then going to ask you to change it again because what I would now like to do is we've talked very much there about kind of existing studies. We've not really talked about COVID-19. So what we will do is I've got a couple of slides, but then I really want to think about, well, that's great for kind of studies, like typical studies, but what have we had to think about for building out COVID-19 studies? Oh, I don't need to share it just yet. Thank you. So before we think about that, I hope that you saw that by me sharing my data entry screen, that was an example of what you see here, that you can look at it as you go. So that means that we can have this interactive review. You can make a change, accept the change, do an in-room change, document it, of course, but you can go through these cycles, which means by the time you get to perform maybe your more traditional signing off of a UAT, you've really gone a lot of the way in minimizing any of those findings because you've already been reviewing them interactively all the way through. So how about COVID-19? So I'd like you all to just take a minute, if you can, to use the link that you see here or to use the QR code that I've got up on the screen. I've tested this and it seemed very straightforward, so hopefully it will work okay for everyone. But if you wouldn't mind just maybe sharing your top considerations about what have you needed to think about, or what do you think others have needed to think about when setting up an actual study that's looking at COVID-19, but also what impact and what considerations have there been just for current studies? How has it impacted any current studies? What changes have you maybe had to make to them, just so that we can get a flavour for what the audience's experience has been there, and maybe have a brief discussion on that before we show you the way that Veeva has worked. So I'll pause for maybe 30 seconds and give you a moment to start entering in your considerations. Okay. Well, feel free to carry on entering them. I think I'm going to pick out key things that I can see here. Delays, it's very big there in the middle. Delays, certainly, protocol deviations, standard ECRFs, I think is a very interesting one, given that we've been talking about those standards and the importance of those. Queries, I think, probably relates to existing studies. Safety is always, of course, paramount. Non-programmer to build is a very interesting one. We can talk to that as we look at how we've been addressing COVID-19 here. Less clinical trials, turnaround times, faster CRF entries. These are all excellent points that I think are themes that I have been hearing as we've been talking to the industry. We'll be sure to include the final slide of this in and provide it to the SCDM team so that you can all see these entries. But let's look at some of these themes, and I think that these fit nicely with the way in which we have been addressing COVID-19, as well as the way in which we're able to manage trials in general, as I hope that you'll see through the demonstration today. And I think this fits nicely into that consideration of when we were talking at the start, what is already a problem but has been magnified, as well as then what are those new challenges. It looks as though a lot of these are probably things I would hear if we were just talking about any trial and what the challenges are, but obviously COVID-19 has really put a magnifying glass over the top of some of these as well. So let me switch back then to the presentation. And sorry, Eric, I'm making you jump around a little with my my screen share back to my slides, but thank you. So from Veeva's experience in this area, these were many of those, the common needs that we were hearing about. So being able to support patients and just through, supporting patients by really helping sponsors and CROs to be fast. Everything is all about speed, but of course, speed, we do not want to be introducing risk. Looking at how we can leverage templates based on standards so that we can do those builds in days and not weeks. As Richard mentioned, we're now talking hours and days, not weeks and even months. And then how can we go about simplifying that documentation? Because there still needs to be documentation to support a study build, but what can we do to make sure that that isn't the factor that extends the timelines of these types of studies? So at Veeva, we've leveraged industry standards. So we have a template study that is based on the latest industry standards from the organizations that you see here. And the reason why we chose to leverage those forms was that, I mean, they'd already been through this expert review. They'd already been looked at by the industry. The FDA has provided feedback. And when I was talking about standards and reuse earlier in the presentation, this is where those standards and reuse can really come into play, because we're able to take that COVID-19 template and then very easily build that example in. So 15 CRFs, 4 visits, some standard validation rules, some standard extracts. We can take that, we can apply that, and then sponsors can just increment those as is necessary, which means the build process can just be hugely accelerated. We can put a process around it where we configure quickly based on the protocol. We can quickly put increments on top of that, the template. We can use the differential report that I'm going to talk about shortly to look at where have we changed, which means we can do a very focused UAT process. So I talked about that iterative piece earlier. We have gone back to almost what looks like on the screen here, a waterfall, bang, bang, bang approach, because you can still do that very quick feedback process, but based on the fact that it's a template and it's already been approved and there's already documentation supporting it, it's really very minimal interactive review that needs to take place. So we can apply that user acceptance approach that we talked about, but it only needs to be very brief, which means we've been able to put things live in 5 to 10 days here based on the study scope, not kind of 4 to 6 weeks. And I've been talking with our services team about this, and they've gone, well, if we're doing this for COVID-19, where else can we apply this? COVID-19 can teach us lessons about where we can, as an industry, do things quicker and look at how can we balance speed and risk together. Of course, you can build things in 5 to 10 days if you throw lots of resource at it. That's not the case here. We've looked at making sure we have a reusable, scalable process that can be repeated both for COVID-19 studies, but also for other studies that might fit the bill to be able to go through this very speedy study design process using the types of study build tools that I've just shown you, as well as the differences report that I'm about to show you, to make sure that design and UAT is focused and is fast and gets you to your FPI date without introducing any unnecessary risks. Now, there's one other thing that COVID-19 introduced that is in existing studies that I very quickly wanted to show you, which was, what if it has impacted your existing study? Now, this was one ask that we got across Veeva, was that I need to be able to say that data has not been collected in according to the schedule because of COVID-19. So I will quickly pull that up for us.
And as you're doing that, Natalie,
thank you.
As you're doing that, there's a question about the interconnectivity across the platform. So I know you're going to show a little bit. If you could also just expand on CDMS, CTMS as you do that as well, that would help answer this question. Thank you.
Absolutely. Now I'm going to share my screen. Now, it's a very brief demonstration for you, but what I want to show you here is that what we were able to introduce, and I'm in the data entry now as a site, so we can see all of my schedule, and I'm actually just going to use my vital signs form to show you that what we were able to roll out was, against my blood pressure, for example, there might have been a reason why an entire form, an entire visit, or just part of a procedure was not done. And we were able to roll out a reason why things were not occurring as they should, which is that COVID-19 is that reason. And this can then be coded on the back end so that you've got information available as part of your extracts and as part of submissions as to the reason why something did not happen as expected. And because we've designed that foundational level that I talked about right at the start to be configurable and to adapt to these types of needs, we built this in as just a purely configurable object within our solution. So it's very quick and easy for us to roll this out across any studies that want to utilize it without the need for us to have any downtime, without the need for us to go in and make individual casebook changes, without the need for kind of extensive sign-offs and testing procedures. With pretty much a click of a button, and we could roll this out to anyone that wanted to utilize it. And that's where I think that foundational architecture piece is something really important for you to consider as you think about how to future-proof yourself against needing to put things in place like this in the future. Now we will move on, and I will be addressing some of those questions as Richard was asking about. If we could jump back into the slides. You've got 20 seconds, because I realize I'm talking a lot and I don't want to keep you longer than I should. You've got 20 seconds to look at how many differences can you find in this picture. I'm afraid I don't have any prizes if anyone gets the correct answer, but I'll let you see if you can at least maybe spot 5 or 10. I stared at it for ages and I still couldn't get the correct answer.
We have the first guess of 7 straight away, so there you go.
Oh, no.
6.
That is incorrect. You do not win the prize. Right. I better not keep you any longer because I've got lots to still get through. There are, at me actually counting the orange squares on here, there were 34 unbelievably. I don't know if anyone got 34. If you did, then you get a round of applause from me. But why am I showing this? I hope that you agree that it was pretty impossible to spot every single one of those. And I think that this proves that computers are actually genuinely better than people at finding differences like this. And I'm showing you this because when you think about you having a set of standards, so be that your COVID-19 standards, any study standards, your TA standards, how can you compare your existing study design back against those standards to understand what you've incremented upon or where you've deviated from those? Or when you're making an amendment, how can you look at what have you changed, what elements have been changed, and again, where do you need to focus your attention on when you're thinking about doing all of your testing in your UAT? So we at Veeva developed what we refer to as the diff report, the differences report. It looks like this. I'm able to generate this to compare whatever I want to compare to whatever. So study to study, study to standards, version to version. And it's a really powerful tool that lets me identify what has changed. So in this example here, we can see I've actually done this for an amendment. I've moved from casebook version 1 to casebook version 2 because I've had an amendment, but it could easily be me comparing a standard to a standard. It gives me a quick count of what changes have been made so I can see what the extent of those changes is and start to think about how much effort it might be for my teams to look through that. And then if we go through just a couple of the example tabs here, I've got my form impact. So in this case, it's just that pink X right at the top there against my AE oncology form. This was actually the change I made to add in the AESI details, for example. So that's the form that's changed. And then if I come on to my next slide, in my schedule, I can see all of the different elements within my schedule here. So I can see all of the forms down the left-hand side, all of the events along the in the previous one, we could see all of the forms, all of the events. And then in this one, we can see what event groups have actually been added. And I'm not going to go through all of the tabs, but as you can see, you can look at what rules have changed, what code lists or units or item groups have changed. So you can get a full picture of anything that has changed from your standards to your study design or from upversioning from one to the other. And what that allows you to do is narrow those UAT efforts down to what matters most. So take a risk-based approach to your UAT. Look at what has changed from your standards and then just rerun your UAT for any changes that they have made between your already approved and reviewed standards and your new study design. And you've got a means of then having documentation about what you've already tested as part of your standards and then what you've built on top of that. Now, of course, based on risk, you might do some regression testing as well, but it really gives you a good foundation to work from rather than having to do an absolute 100% mega effort to get through your UAT cycle, especially for a complex study.
And Natalie, if I can just add something to that, you may be going to do this, but there's a key question about, which I think is relevant here. So customers and sponsors that may have standards in another tool, can this be applied to that as well if you're importing standards from Rave, for example?
Yeah, so if you have standards in another tool and you wanted to run this comparison, my advice would be to bring those standards over so that you can then run it against them. So you could import those standards in and then run a comparison against them from that perspective. That wouldn't be a problem. So we covered a lot there in study design, but I think study design is a really large topic. So from a best practices perspective, we're thinking about shifting from recreating things to reuse, from waterfall to agile, from doing things in segmented and siloed approaches to working much more collaboratively, from doing things just as an offline UAT to being in a real-time room, from 100% to a targeted, focused UAT process. And from manual creation to self-documentation. I don't have time to show you everything in the demo as much as I would love to, but what we were building out within that schedule view, the system is documenting all of that and you can generate a specification off the back of it rather than having to first write that specification. Now, the final piece in terms of design is that amendment process, which I'm going to speed through, but I do want to make sure we just get another quick survey here, same format. What challenges, what are the top things you think about, pain, problems when it comes to amendments? So same process, if you are able to just put your immediate thoughts into this PowerPoint, that would be very appreciated, and I will pull it up for us to consider.
I won't give the answer yet, Natalie. There's a couple in the questions which I will add if they don't appear.
Oh, perfect. Thank you, Richard.
Can I just say thank you to everyone for the questions? I'm not sure I've been this busy on a Q&A ever, so I hope I am struggling to keep up, but I will try and get through all of the questions. But please keep them coming.
Now let me share these as they come in. I was really excited to see what would come in about this because I've got my personal experiences, but always interested to hear from others. Old data loss, very scary things. I think data loss is probably one of the top concerns. The number of changes, the timelines, specification changes, which when you're doing a self-documenting specification will automatically be amended. Flexibility, ethics approval, so thinking about rolling things out on a country level, rolling things out just even down to a site and patient level we could talk to.
The one that's in the Q&A, Natalie, as well, is the fear of making a mistake as well. So.
Oh, yes. And that as well, I think, leads to that scary area of data loss as well, isn't it? If you do something wrong and the impact that can have on your absolutely essential data. Now, I'm going to let these carry on coming in, but I'm conscious of the time. So what I'm going to do is I'll keep on sharing my screen, Eric, and I will show you the amendment that we just made and how we would go about rolling that out and what that amendment process looks like. And really what our philosophy has been around performing that type of amendment. So if we come back, forgive my clicking, I'm going to come back into that study that we were working with a moment ago. We're going to look at the data entry for it, and we're also going to look at the studio build for it. And we're also going to look at our EDC tools. So now I'm in the latest version in my development environment for this. So this kind of covers that making a mistake question as well. So this would be the exact same process if I were doing it within production, but I'm going to test it out in my development environment. I'm in version 2 in my development environment. Now in my EDC tools, I'm going to come in to look at that same environment. And so my development environment, my highest casebook version is version number 2. These are all of the sites. And I can see that site 702, they're still working on version 1. So I was entering data for this site against version 1. So any patients in there are casebook version 1, and I want to move them to casebook version 2 and see if that AESI information works for them. So if we come to my site 702 in data entry, and I'm speeding through this, I completely appreciate it. I'm always happy to have follow-up discussions on this process, of course. Patient number 1 has got some adverse events entered down here at the bottom. And we can see like an example of one of those. They've entered an EGFR rash. There's no AESI information here for this because they're on that version 1. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take a look at the patients that we have in that site. So site 702, we've got our patient number 1. They're on version number 1. I can perform a retrospective amendment for this patient. Oh, actually, sorry, I do need to actually update the site first to be on the right version. So let's do that first. So I need to move my site to be on version number 2. which is as simple as me saying site's now on version 2. So new patients are now going to have version number 2 applied. So that's what we call a prospective amendment. Any new patients will be on the new version, but I want to move my existing patient over. So I can pick my patient from my list. This is going to retrospectively apply it out. So I can choose what event to do this from. I'm going to do it from the very start. I can run it. This is not going to have any downtime. It's not going to have any migration. So we're not migrating the data from one version to another. We're simply appending the new study design against the existing study design. We often get the question, well, what if the site's already in there entering data? The system would very temporarily kick them out of that CRF. There is autosave within our solution, so they're never going to lose any data that they've been entering as they go. And when they refresh and come back into that patient, the change is going to have been made. So there is absolutely very minimum impact on anyone, even if they just happen to be in there at the point of you pressing and performing this amendment. You are not going to be at that risk of data loss and all of those scary things as I come back here and we see things still coming in. The data is not going to be migrated, hence it's not going to have that risk of being lost. It's very quick to do the changes that I just showed you in terms of following those same processes that we were talking about before, the iterative design of this. You can test it in your development environment to see what that impact is going to be on those patients before you then go through and, of course, deploy it to your live subjects. You've got full flexibility when it comes to IRB or EC approvals, who's going to get it rolled out when. So you can do it site by site, patient by patient, country by country, whatever makes sense in terms of what type of amendment that you're working through. And retrospectively, you can even pick at what point to roll it out as a patient from. So maybe any patients that have already been randomized, you don't need to roll something out, whereas for other patients you do. I just really want to emphasize that this has been a huge area of focus for Veeva because we see all of those challenges that you've been putting up here on that screen, and we wanted to make sure that we address them full on, because both for traditional studies as well as the environment we find ourselves in with COVID-19, where we're seeing changes needing to be made and there's more adaptive trials come on board, I think it's absolutely essential that amendments they are the norm now. Let's not fear them and let's not try and avoid them, because we want protocol designs to be the best that they can be. Let's embrace them and make them an easy thing to be able to achieve within the system. Now, if I refresh this, we should see that that has been completed. And then if we come back in and out of my patient, we'll see the adverse event is now orange because it's now incomplete, because we have added in that AESI information. So now if I come in, we can see AESI is here. I can say yes, and the reason, we'll just say that this is, self-evident because it's new. And our AESI information now gets asked because of that branching we put in. So we put that branching in, if you recall. So yes, it appears. No, it does not. And if we'd already entered something, it would clear it out, which is a whole different discussion for me to have with you. But just to show the way in which that amendment is rolled out, we can see it's super quick and super easy. Okay, if we could grab the slides, I shall move to start. Maybe we'll move toward, I appreciate everyone's time, we'll move towards some wrapping up thoughts and comments. I've got so much that I could talk to you about, but slides here showing same database, data doesn't move. So what we've just seen is being presented here on that slide. As we go from version to version, you are not migrating, you are not having downtime, and you are not at that risk of data loss that we have seen before. We can grab those metrics as well for you to feed into your study design optimization processes. So be it as part of an amendment that you want to make optimizations, or be it part of future study designs, we capture some very interesting metrics about the way in which things have been programmed that you can pull out in dashboards, and you can therefore maybe remove low-risk edit checks. You can improve CRFs that have got high query rates. We give you all of that information at your fingertips. And we covered a lot there from EDC. I want to just spend a minute or two thinking about future innovation and virtualization, because there's a whole lot else going on, isn't there, out there in the industry. There's a philosophy here around adaptive and virtual trials. I think it really echoes the discussions that there have been earlier today, that trials are not adaptive just because we call them that COVID-19 has opened us up to many new ways of working, different consent processes. eCOA data is more important than ever before. Patient interactions, telephone visits, all of those things that as an industry we've been talking about for a long time, and we have been doing. Virtual trials are not new, but they've really been accelerated, and I think being flagged as even more critical now that we find ourselves in the pandemic. Thinking about different requirements vary on the different needs of the trials. How do we create hybrid models? And I think this final point is a core theme that I've been talking about today, is having the infrastructure to have that flexibility. You don't want to start building a virtual trial model if you don't have that fundamental core infrastructure that's going to allow you to do so. Now, I've not got time to show you this today, but Site Vault, this is an example of one of the additional technologies that we have been able to introduce very swiftly to establish some decentralized processes. So, and thinking about that connectivity with CTMS as well, that was part of a question. EDC is connected with CTMS, so data about SDV that's been completed within EDC and all of the patients and their statuses, they get pushed over into Vault CTMS, so that then they form part of monitoring visits. Part of monitoring right now, of course, is how do we do remote SDV? It was one of the first things that we started to kind of get flagged questions about, was monitors can't go to the sites anymore. I'm in a Facebook group with a load of CRAs and people in the industry, and all of the CRAs are going, I can't visit my site. Like, how does life become the new normal for me as a CRA? And remote SDV was absolutely essential for us to think about there. So this is a free solution for sites. Sites are able to kind of access this. They can use it as an e-reg binder, so they can store all of their important documents there. It's purpose-built for those. They can use it for other studies that they have up and running. So sites don't want to have to upload things into the eTMF. They can load things up into here. And this is what we've been able to leverage very quickly and easily for remote SDV. So SDV documents can be loaded in, they can have redaction put on them, and we can put them through a process to make sure that they're routed through to the correct person for them to be reviewed. And the monitoring teams can simply come in and access and look at that SDV source documentation and perform their SDV in that way, and then use EDC and the monitoring views that we have purpose-built for them within EDC just to continue to perform their review as they normally would, with access to the documents through this remote model. So that's just one example of how we've been able to swiftly react and enable a decentralized process. There are a whole other group of things to think about. I know that virtualization, we immediately think about eConsent, eCOA. How do we manage those areas? We are working at Veeva on the MyVeeva application that starts to address a whole host of those considerations. But as you think about your virtualization strategies, think of that bigger picture. I've seen a lot of questions earlier today about what do we do if there are illiterate patients? How do we get them to consent remotely? What does that process look like? How do we manage direct-to-patient shipments if the local regulations don't let us capture that patient shipping address information in a system? Right? How do we route around that? We're working with RTSM partners here at Veeva to establish kind of best practices around how to utilize EDC in combination with RTSM solutions to get these virtual processes in place. Safety came up, I think, in an earlier discussion as well. What if a patient's entering ePro data that triggers a safety signal, and how does that go through to the PV system? I don't have all of the answers here today. I just wanted to really flag that it's on my mind all of the time. I know it's on Veeva's mind, and we are looking at how do we start to introduce technologies. And as Richard's about to kind of wrap things up with as well, how do we learn from other industries about how to make sure we tackle this in a way that isn't just a knee-jerk reaction, but is putting down the next set of foundations for the future of for virtual trials to run alongside our traditional trials that we see right now. So with that, Richard, I'm going to pass over to you to wrap up today's discussion from Veeva about how we can look to outside of our industry for some inspiration in that area.
Thanks, Natalie. So I've got 6 questions to go. So apologies to anyone I don't get to your questions. Again, thank you very much. I hope I've answered them all, but there we go. So look, a quick wrap up, and I hope this has been useful. We tried to kind of show some ideas that we're thinking of, and I hope they mirror yours. From the chat, I have to say, it feels like a lot of our ideas are very, very familiar and comfortable with your own thinking and the direction you're attempting to move in. One of the things we've really done is think about the current state and where we want to be as a future state, recognizing that thanks to COVID, that future state feels very, very near term. It doesn't feel future state is the right word, because now it's like we're trying to achieve these things here and now. But I think that's why we try to connect this idea of a philosophical conversation to a technology one. You know, philosophically, we are trying to do things in real time. We're trying to react to growing complexity. But the reality is we're also tied down. And this picture here is a very simplistic attempt by myself to show that. You know, we have disconnected data and processes. We have data in different places in different systems. We spend a lot of time trying to wire and reconnect that data. We have multiple user experiences. Every consumer and contributor of data is logging into multiple tools, often re-entering exactly the same data, transcribing queries and data from one system to another. And that leads to limited business visibility. We are slow to react. We just don't have real-time visibility of what's happening in a real world. Now, I could spend a lot of time on this slide, but how about I go to my last slide, because I think we're going to run out of time and I want to be respectful. And I will just share 2 examples. These are companies that I'm sure are very familiar to all of you, but let's use these as a moment to reflect on why these companies became so familiar with us. Blockbuster Video was a huge business. It was built on this idea of individuals walking into a store and renting a video or a DVD. Huge business. But if you look at how they came from the peak of their business to being out of business, to being bankrupt, it's an incredibly short period of time. And the reason it's so short is because companies like Netflix jumped up and took over that market. But something you should be aware of, the 2 guys who started Netflix, when they first had this idea, they needed money. They needed an investor. And they went to see the board of a company and said, we've got this idea. We think it can revolutionize the way people consume films. And the board of that company threw them out of their board meeting, said it was a silly idea. The board that I'm referring to is the Blockbuster Video board. 1 year later, they started to suffer. 18 months later, they filed for bankruptcy. That's all in the public domain. They had an opportunity to change, and they chose not to change because it was painful. They thought it was going to be difficult. Well, less than 3 years later, they had no business to defend. And we all know the Netflix story from there. So, yes, change might be painful, but it's about doing the right thing. It's about sticking to that direction we want to take. Now, another example before I stop. Kodak, a company that used to probably be the most prevalent camera film producer in the world, went through a whole host of problems in the last 10 years with the advent of new technology. But you know, when they went through their archives and they looked through some of the prototypes the Kodak team had built, they found the prototype for an iPhone built in the 70s. And it had been parked because Kodak executives said, we don't want to go there because it will hurt our camera film business. I wonder how much they regret that decision now, because how many of us use camera films today? So I share those. We could talk a lot more about it, but I'm very conscious of time and I want to be respectful of everyone. So how about we pause there and I'll hand back to you, Natalie, for final words.
Thank you, Richard. I think they're really pertinent examples. As I'm sure you could all tell, Richard and I would love to talk about this all day long. But I hope that was helpful. I hope that that's given you an insight into how we're approaching this and some of the thoughts that are going through our minds in terms of where we need to go next to be able to continue to support the ever-changing landscape within clinical trials. I'd just like to thank you all for your participation. Nobody won the prize for guessing the right amount of changes that there were, or the differences, and spot the difference, I'm afraid. So there is no winner there today other than the computer. But thank you once again to the attendees. Thank you to SCDM for having us, and we look forward to working with, I hope, all of you in the future at future events.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Natalie and Richard. I believe I'm audible, right? Just an audio check.
Yes, Krupesh.
Perfect. So thank you so much, Natalie and Richard, for a very insightful and interactive presentation. I'm sure this would help the data managers in understanding the key considerations while managing studies, especially during situations like COVID-19. And a special thanks to Richard for managing these questions and giving a clear and descriptive responses. Right, you both, in my mind, complemented each other and answered all the queries in detail. So that was really awesome. And a big thanks to you both on behalf of the entire attendees present there, right? So I believe it is very clear that we need to have a strong technology platform to support the patients, the sponsors, and the sites for managing the virtual trials. Okay, great. So I'm mindful and cognizant of the time zone difference, and I really appreciate your flexibility to be part of this event. So on behalf of the SCDM committee and everyone out here, thank you so very much once again, and have a great weekend, Natalie and Richard.
Thank you very much for having us.
Thank you.
Thank you. So, wow. So, as I promised you all in the morning, we had an eventful day, right? And I'm also aware of the fact that it's a Saturday evening for all of us, and I do not want to delay it any further. And I would now hand it over to Mayank for the closing remarks and for the word of thanks. So, Mayank, over to you.
Thank you, Krupesh. Eric, can you bring me on the camera? Okay. So, thank you everyone for your patience. Thank you for staying till the last session. And when we see the numbers still there on the call is really motivating. More than 300 people are still attending this call. So thank you for that. I would like to thank you, Craig, Kent, Michael in the morning for the keynote speak. Actually, it was fantastic. It set up the right tone for the event and it went in the very right direction. Followed by Nikita, Rupa, Jagdish, Sudeep, and Shobit for the fantastic panel discussion. It actually set up the complete first 3 hours, went in a very good shape to set up the tone for the 2 workshops. So thank you everyone. Thank you leadership there for contributing to that. Coming to Jashila, our special guest speaker today, a very good content from a perspective of how a unified platform should look like. So thank you, Jeff, for sharing your thoughts. Special thanks to Medidata and Veeva for the workshops. It was a long workshop, and I saw in both the workshops, teams were going to answer almost every question what was asked. So it was really well done, and most of the people actually felt overwhelming by receiving those responses on an ongoing basis. I would like to give a special thank to Bhavesh. Though Bhavesh does not have a live session here, but what you guys are going to get is a 30-minute recording from Bhavesh on his experience, how he managed the site during the COVID-19 situation. I will request everyone to watch that video. You will be shared with the link along with the feedback form. So go and watch it and do share your feedback with Bhavesh and with all of us. And if you have any questions, we can share with Bhavesh. Special thanks to our partners, Oracle, Covance, and PRA for supporting us from a sponsorship perspective. It was never possible without having the right set of sponsors. So thank you for that. And my three gems here, I don't see still Kripesh on the webcam, but thank you, Nagalakshmi, Deepu, and Kripesh. It was a lot of hard work these three people have done. This was our first experience for the virtual trial. We were learning, and they were part of this learning. They anchor the entire thing. So thank you, three of you, and making sure that this event goes well. And take my words, it looks very simple to become a co-chair, but the amount of hard work people give to this entire event is tremendous. So thank you, three of you. I will never say it's the least or the last, but my steering committee. That's where we all come together. Each person in the steering committee is a gem for me because they all support in different capacity and the way we want to arrange things. Most of them were not part of the co-chair or the organizing committee, but they supported us with the right set of content, right set of people, giving rationale why we should be doing this, when we should be doing it. So there's a lot of thought leadership which is put from the steering committee from SCDM India. So thank you, SCDM India steering committee. Our SCDM board, without them, it was not possible to getting an event where there is no entry fee. So thank you, board, for bringing us the right set of technology and the forum where we can interact with the maximum people across India. Our MCI team, which comprises of Anuja, Pradeep, Trifeen, and Aninda, great job done. Last 2-3 days have been really nightmare for everyone to organize everything together. So thank you, MCI team there. Last but not the least is Eric and Blue Sky team. Thank you, Eric, for staying with us from the morning till now and supporting us. And the event has gone well. We always have certain areas of improvement which will work. Please share your feedbacks, and we will make sure that we'll come next time with a better version. The next big event which is coming will be the US SCDM conference. So I will request all of you to enroll for that. That is also virtual 2 to 3 days conference. You will see more global speakers, more global content and perspective, and it will be a great learning for you. And India team will be coming back to you with the SCDM India conference. We have still not decided the final decision on that. We'll wait for a month's time, and then we'll come back to you guys. But without your support, it was never possible. It will never be possible. So keep supporting us, keep attending these events, and it will be a fantastic journey for us. Thank you. Over to you, Shobit. You can do the final close down.
No, I'm good, man. Thank you so much for doing the vote of thanks. I really appreciate everybody's contribution, the co-chairs. I can see the peacefulness on their faces now. We were quite anxious and a bit nervous yesterday. Just remember that this was the first ever virtual event organized by SCDM globally, right? And we were trying our best to ensure that there were no hiccups, no glitches, and touch wood, we had a very good day, good participation, and I think all the prayers by the participants also helped, right? So we were able to carry on seamlessly and noiselessly. We had a lunch break also, right? 1 hour of lunch break, so we didn't miss on the breaks, coffee break, a tea break, a lunch. So I think everybody enjoyed it. I thoroughly enjoyed the entire day. 3 great keynote speakers, as Mayank said, and followed by some breathtaking workshops, right? Medidata and Veeva coming onto the floor and talking about how DCT is shaping up and how technology can change the world, right? And last but not the least, Mayank, your leadership in driving the India Steering Committee, really appreciate it. Thank you so much. You appreciated everybody, you thanked everybody, but there has to be somebody to thank the man behind the scenes. Thanks, Mayank, for all the guidance, support, and you have just stood by all the teams, provided the right guidance at all point of times. When everybody was even in panic, you were very calm, patient, and you navigated through the entire journey seamlessly. Thank you so much. And guys, thank you everybody for joining in. And looking forward for the next big event, which is the annual one. And hopefully come December, we will come back with the India event as well. So keeping fingers crossed, stay tuned, and do enjoy Bhavesh's recording. It would be really a great memento for each one of us to take back, a souvenir for us to take back. So happy learning, guys, and thank you. Have a nice weekend, the rest of the weekend. It's Saturday afternoon, evenings. So you have the full evening. You have the full evening, and I remember Kripesh telling me that he will celebrate the evening. So Kripesh, the evening is yours, man.
Enjoy, guys. Thank you.
On behalf of SCDM, I would like to thank you for your participation in today's event. A post-event survey will appear requesting your feedback. Please take a moment to complete the survey as it will help plan future web events. This concludes today's program. Thank you and have a great day.